I'm Jenni Carlson.
I'm Barry Tramel. Welcome to the Jenni and Barry Show. Sooners are coming off a bye week and getting ready to enter the stretch run of the season. Lots and lots to talk about that and more. But before we get to all things Sooner football, we want to say thanks to these sponsors for supporting the Jenni and Barry Show. MidFirst Bank, Laser Light Skin Clinic, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, and the Oklahoma Ford Dealers Association. Drive into your best in Oklahoma Ford dealers today for the best deals on Ford's full lineup of trucks and SUVs. Ford is the best in Oklahoma. Jacko, a newcomer comes to town on Saturday. Central Florida will be at Owen Field. And before the season started, you might have chalked this up to being a tough game for OU. Now the Knights have gone off the rails. What has gone wrong for Gus Malzahn's team?
Woof, yeah. Sort of has fallen into the same fate that most of the teams that have joined the Big 12 have this year. They're just struggling. And, I guess maybe this is what you expect when a team joins the Power Five for the first time, that they are going to have some growing pains. I think we expected that Houston was going to have growing pains. They have. We expected that Cincinnati would have growing pains. They have. But UCF seemed like, maybe in addition to BYU, the team that would come in and be able to compete better right away. And instead, they have not had the results that you would want. I mean, they had Baylor beaten, Barry, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. They had him beat and gave up a ton of fourth quarter points. So it has to be a disappointing go right now for UCF, for their fans to not be playing better in the Big 12. But, they come to Norman as a team that is in dire need of some Big 12 success.
UCF's got to be kicking itself. They lose John Reese Plumlee, their really good quarterback. We thought he'd be an impact player in the Big 12. He gets hurt in week 2, hasn't returned. But UCF's offense has been pretty good. Timmy McClain is a transfer from South Florida. They've been putting up points. They lose a tough one to K-State in a really good game. Then, as you mentioned, they take a 36-10 lead in the fourth quarter on Baylor and give it up for crying out. 35-10, lose 36-35. Unbelievable meltdown. Then they go to Kansas, get steamrolled. So they gotta be just wondering what's going on. And I'm sort of mystified on how all of the newcomers are struggling. If they'd come into a prime Big 12, if they'd come into the Big 12 of 2 or 3 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, you could understand it. But this is not a. This is a watered down Big 12. It's the weakest the league's ever been, and yet they're there at the bottom. The newcomers, along with Baylor, are the worst teams in the league.
Yeah, it is really surprising. And I know that most of the newcomers were picked low in the preseason polls and stuff, Barry, but I thought that was just because, we didn't have a good idea of what they'd be. But that's really proving to be absolutely true. I'm surprised by that. I don't know about you, but I thought we'd see more wins out of the newbies, and maybe they're coming, but you look at the fact that all 4 of them still have to play a surging OSU team. OU's still got a couple on the schedule. Obviously already played Cincinnati at UCF coming up. I don't know. I don't think there's a ton of wins against legacy Big 12 teams waiting out there for these teams.
It doesn't appear to be. I thought UCF and Brigham Young, I thought UCF might finish 4, 5, 6 range. I thought BYU would be middle of the pack. I figured Houston and Cincinnati would struggle just because of where those programs were coming into this year. But what we're seeing is it's just a difficult transition. And, if you look back historically, it has been a little bit rough. We haven't had a ton, we haven't had a ton of mid-major advancements into the power structure. We've got the TCU lesson from 10 years ago. The Horned Frogs had a little bit of a struggle first year in the Big 12, got going pretty good by year 3 in the Big 12, was a national contender. But you just sort of figured these teams been playing high-quality opponents, each other for one thing, in the American Conference, and doing well in in non-conference games and bowl games and whatnot. So I'm a little surprised, but clearly the roster takes a while to build up. Clearly there's a difference in quality of athlete. Most of these coaches that I talked to, the 4 newcomers, they were all they had 2 modes going. One was concern that they weren't up to speed yet, and the other was mystery on exactly how they matched up with the Oklahomas, the Texases, the Oklahoma States, the Texas Techs, those kinds of programs. So they're learning the hard way. It's going to be a tough transition here in year 1.
Even though UCF is struggling heading into this game against OU, if there was ever a time for a Sooner letdown, this might be it, Barry. Coming off that big win against Texas, obviously. Is there concern? Should there be concern about any sort of letdown coming off that big Red River win?
Well, now this is far before your time. 20-something like you doesn't remember the old days, but this used to be a big deal. The post-Texas letdown in Norman. Mostly it was a sort of Switzer phenomenon. Now, it also was more myth than fact. But a couple of, doesn't take much to get a theory going, and there was always that concern. My memory is that didn't really affect Bob Stoops that much, his era coming out of Texas. But it perfectly makes sense, right? I mean, biggest OU win under Brent Venables, huge statement performance, and the emotion that goes into that game, the revelry that comes out of that game. It's just a natural tendency. On top of this, though, we had the off week. So does the off week sort of absorb? Is it the quicker picker upper? Does it clean up all the spillage of the mess? I don't know. We're gonna find out. A perfect letdown would have been the Sooners playing Central Florida last week. This week, we'll see if it's back to business.
Yeah, that's a great point. And by the way, if we keep this segment going long enough, we'll get you all sorts of 80s references, Barry. You can talk about the Sooners in the 80s and add 80 slogans. This could be fun. I don't know where this is going, but
Don't ever get me into the 70s. You'll never get me off the air. We'll have an 8-hour podcast.
Maybe someday we'll give that a try. But it does seem like a letdown is possible, that maybe we're not going to see the Sooners playing at the high level that we saw them play in the Cotton Bowl. But, I do think that, this is now a team that has to be mindful. And I know we're going to talk at some point here about playoff potential, but if you're a team that's in the conversation for the college football playoff, now you got to be mindful of playing well all the time. You want to continue to build that resume for the college football playoff selection committee. So, could there be a letdown? Yes. But if the Sooners are focused on not only, week to week, but potential big goals, contending again for championships, both in the Big 12 and beyond, to me, that should set them up mentally to not have the letdowns. But this is a new team. You've got obviously the Venables era. This is uncharted territory for this group and for this coaching staff. So how do they approach it? That's going to be something that we're going to get a chance to see. And the answer is, we don't know. Could there be a letdown? Absolutely. Will there? We're going to have to wait to see on Saturday.
Yeah, Brent Venables doesn't strike you as the kind of coach that would be in the business of letting his team, sort of take a week off or not be ready emotionally. I mean, Brent's always ready emotionally, whether it's kickoff for the Cotton Bowl or a Tuesday in April when you run into him at Safeway. So, he's always on edge. He's always on. His motor's always running. If a team is a reflection of its coach, it's probably a good sign for the Sooners. But this is the kind of test that a program needs. This is the kind of sort of a mental check that's good for a revamped situation like Oklahoma going into from Lincoln Riley to Brent Venables. This is the kind of thing you need to learn about yourself. So, let me ask you, Jacko, what would you like to see out of the Sooners after the energy and emotion of that OU Texas game?
Yeah, I think they didn't have a ton of penalties in the Texas game, which I thought was a huge tip of the cap deserved for the Sooners, that they were in such a highly charged game, and you didn't see a ton of mistakes, a ton of unforced errors. We saw Texas make several of those. They had several 15-yard penalties that were big in that game. So I think limiting penalties and busts and just unforced errors. If they can have a game, and UCF might come in here and, have some tricks up their sleeve and do some things to score or hold the Sooners. I mean, that's entirely possible. So I'm not going to say I need to see a shutout or I need to see a 40-point win. But I think if Oklahoma can play cleanly again, I'd like to see that. And frankly, Barry, one of the things coming out of that Texas game that I didn't love was Texas receivers running a little too wide open for my liking, or probably Brent Venables' liking. So I'd like to see a few less receivers running without any Sooner close to them. I think those two things, limiting penalties, staying clean, staying as close to penalty free as you can, and then clean up some of that coverage situations. I don't know if it was miscommunications. Texas obviously has a great play caller in Steve Sarkisian. It might have been scheme. But to not have as many receivers running open, I think would be a good step too.
It's a great point, and that's one of the things about winning a game, right? Is you don't focus on, when I say you, I'm talking about fans, media, whoever, not really Brent Venables, but you don't concentrate on the things that went wrong. You celebrate all the things that went right.
Sure.
And the truth is, down in Dallas, all kinds of things didn't go great for the Sooners, and that was number one on the list. That particularly the middle of the field, open receivers. Clearly, Steve Sarkisian found something schematic to get the Sooners in the wrong place, and away we went. Saw quite a bit of that from Kansas against Oklahoma State the other day. You see it all over football. It's just part of the give and take of the game of football. I like OU's chances of fortifying that, though, because of Venables. If they have to fix something more concrete, like, say, the running game, well, I'm not as confident. But fix holes in the defense with Brent Venables, I think that's likely to happen. So I'm sort of with you on that. The one thing I would like to see, in addition, is I would like to see the tailback game get going. Maybe more. I'm waiting for Javonte Barnes to get healthy. I want to see if that's a deal, because that's the thing that concerns me, is that OU offense just can't get the running game. And maybe we might talk about this later, but that's my number one concern, I would think, is just getting the running game going.
Yeah, I think we will hit on that in a second, more extendedly. But back to the defense for just a second. Something that Oklahoma doesn't need to do much fixing on, and that we don't necessarily need to see because we've already seen it, is keeping the other team out of the end zone, Barry. Seven touchdowns, 7 offensive touchdowns by opponents in 6 games. Just a remarkable number when you think about where this defense was a year ago. Just really hard to think that they would be in a position to be able to say that statistically at this point. Can they keep that up? Is there any chance that kind of, well, at the end of the season, we're saying, man, they only allowed like 12 or 14 offensive touchdowns this year?
I don't think so, for 3 reasons. One is it's 2023, 1956. Number 2 is the Selman brothers continue to be ineligible to play for the Sooners. So as much as we love the Dason McCullough, Dejon Terry, Danny Stutzman, Bothroyd, Billy Bowman, Peyton Bowen, all those guys, as much as we love them, they're not the Selman brothers and Rod Shope. So, and number 3, the Sooners are actually about to hit a little stretch of potent offenses. Whatever the problem is in Orlando, it hasn't been offensively. UCF has done a great job moving the ball and scoring points, even in their slide. Timmy McClain, as I mentioned, really good backup quarterback. He's been producing. Gus Malzahn is an offensive whiz as a coach. So, and next week, Kansas. Sooners go to Kansas. Jayhawks can score. So they're not going to give up 3 touchdowns total in those 2 games. I don't think. If they do, we're going to have to reconvene this show and change the narrative. I think they can play solid defense. Hold those teams. Let's say you hold those two teams to 5 collective touchdowns. I think that's really good defense. I think that's winning defense. That would be a good sign going forward. We talked about those receivers running, the Longhorn receivers running free.
Yeah.
I look at OU's defensive backs, and they strike me as not the greatest of coverage people. Woody Washington's good. Gentry Williams is good, breaking on the ball and stuff. But you go into the safety position, and I look at Billy Bowman. His biggest contributions to that game, not necessarily in pass coverage, but in physicality.
Yeah.
And he hits the hard hit on, was it Sanders, the tight end, that he popped so hard and caused the interception. If you make mistakes in coverage, you need to make it up somewhere. And I thought the Sooners out hit Texas. The games run together on me, but it wasn't that the game where 4 or 5 times per quarter a guy was laying on the ground, a little banged up, not real hurt, but laying on the ground. Most of the time that was the Longhorns laying on the ground. So I thought the Sooners out hit Texas, and that's a very good sign for Brent Venables' defense. If you can't cover them, knock them down. And I think that's one thing Brent can build on if he does have coverage issues. We'll see if he does. The corners are good. Gentry Williams, Woody Washington, that's a good corner tandem. So I think it's probably a safety issue over the middle of the field. That's usually the deal.
Yeah.
But that's one play. That's one way I would say. That's one way they're making up for whatever deficiencies they might have.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there are some issues, and this is not a perfect defense, still an evolving defense. But if you think about keeping teams out of the end zone, if they get to the end of the year and in 2023 you allow, let's say it's an average of 2 touchdowns a game. Let's say that's what they get to the end of the season allowing. Right now it's a little over 1. They get to the end of the season and allow 2 touchdowns on average per game. That's really good. That means that they've figured out a way to cover up those deficiencies, whether it's, safeties that aren't maybe great in coverage just yet. Maybe that's, whatever it is, whatever the issue is, I think that would be a good goal number, because there are things that you're not going to be perfect at. And, Barry, let's switch to the offensive side of the ball, talking about, maybe some deficiencies. The Sooners just lost potentially their best wide receiver, and Andrell Anthony got an injury. He's going to be out for the rest of the year. That leaves them looking a little different at wide receiver. How big of a loss is Andrell Anthony in your mind?
I feel bad in saying this, and this has really nothing to do with Andrell Anthony, but I don't think it's that big of a loss for 2 reasons. One, Anthony, while being a very good player, had really not. This is not losing CeeDee Lamb. This is not losing Hollywood Brown. This is not losing somebody that has clearly established himself as a big-time playmaker. He's well on that way. He's on a nice road. He was doing a really good job. But the difference between the guys below Andrell Anthony, it's not as great as if you lose a superstar. The other thing about Oklahoma receivers, and frankly most receivers, which everyone from NFL general managers to 8th grade coaches should know, is wide receivers fall out of trees. The world does not have a shortage of quality wide receivers. You lose a defensive tackle and, batten down the hatches. But a wide receiver, those guys can be found. And I think they can probably be found on this OU roster. I don't know who's going to make up for the production. I think you'll see probably a committee type situation. We clearly, Nick Anderson's become a big play receiver. He's at 6 touchdowns, 11 catches, I think, is his ratio. Throw him the ball more. Jack Harris Petaway had a big game, had a lot of catches in week 1, hadn't done much since, but he's already played at this level. So I think they'll be able to find production. I just don't know where it's coming from, and it doesn't have to be from one person, I guess is the way I would say it.
Yeah, and I think Oklahoma does have a wide receiver group that, does have some potential, does have some talent. I mean, even a guy like Brennan Thompson, who had, played his first game before the Texas game and then was pretty, quiet against Texas. I mean, you've got guys that have shown they can do some stuff. So those guys, it just means more chances for guys down the pecking order. And will they step up? How will they play? How consistent will they be? I think that's the thing that, to me, you started to see Andrel Anthony be a guy that looked like, along with Drake Stoops, probably one of those safety valve guys for Dillon Gabriel, where if things were going amiss, he knew he could find Andrel Anthony and probably make a positive play. So that becomes a little less likely. But I mean, I think they do have pass catchers. I think maybe the tight ends are where you look for a little bit more production. Haven't thrown to the tight ends a ton. Tight ends always open in my world. Go ahead and throw it to one of those guys. But Barry, I think something that we referenced this earlier, the run game, where the OU run game is, I think on the offensive side of the ball has got to be the biggest concern right now. Seems to be stuck in neutral, but what are the long-term ramifications? It hasn't bitten the Sooners yet. What are the long-term ramifications of a run game that seemingly really can't get going?
Well, I don't think it's a deal breaker. 20 years ago, I thought it was a deal breaker. When Bob Stoops got to town, he famously recall, I would say that Bob read or retained approximately 1% of anything I ever wrote about college football. But the 1% he remembers is when he got here and he hired Mike Leach. I said, I don't know. This is the middle of America. This is, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado. You got to run the ball. Now, throwing's fine, but you got to run the ball in middle America. It gets cold in the winter, late in the season, wind's heavy. You can't pass your way to prowess. And then, of course, Mike Leach and Josh Heupel come along, and, pretty soon you got Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray, and everybody knows the story. Stoops cackles at that still. He'll get he won't call me by name, but he'll say, they said we had to run the ball. We couldn't run the air raid, blah. So he gets a chuckle out of that. And, of course, he was right. Who knew that Bob Stoops would know more football than me? The miracles never cease. But I've come to trust Bob on that. You don't have to run the ball anymore in American football. You can win. The NFL shows us it's nice to run, but you don't have to. And the Sooners have found enough wrinkles, primarily with Dillon Gabriel. Whether it's not just scrambling, but he's done some nice option runs. The quarterback draw was a huge play repeatedly in the Texas game. So I think the Sooners will be able to get by if they have to. Here's we've done a lot of comparisons with 2000 and the OU Renaissance season when they won the national title, and this one, when not a lot of expectations, they get on a roll, they sort of blossom against Texas, away they go. If you remember in 2000, the OU running game was also slow to prosper. That's when, Quentin Griffin was in year number 1, I guess. That's the year they brought him out of redshirt. Or not bringing him out of redshirt, but it's when he sort of mid-season emerged is a good word. And he ended up being a really valuable producer. But that was not a September phenomenon. That was a slow build. Maybe the running game is moving slowly, building to something. We haven't seen it yet. We don't know even who's the builder. We don't know who's going to get the loaf of bread to carry. Like I said, Javonte Barnes would be my pick if he can get healthy. But I've not lost hope in the running game, but they don't have to have it to be successful.
Yeah, and I think what you said about wrinkles is right, and Gabriel's the biggest of those wrinkles, Barry. I mean, he's definitely become more of a force in the run game. I think he's gotten better at it. I think his vision as a runner is way better than some of the mobile quarterbacks we've seen over the years. So I think he's definitely a weapon that they can use. And frankly, the fact that he's got Jackson Arnold backing him up probably makes everybody breathe a little easier when he does take off. So that ability is they're able to sort of plug into that, if you will. But yeah, I mean, it's been a mystery to see sort of the back and forth, and Sawchuk's gotten a little run, but really hasn't been very effective. So he's kind of been left by the wayside. Tyree Walker seems to have emerged in the Texas game after Marcus Major wasn't getting it done. So yeah, if Barnes could get healthy and they could, see what they've got, I mean, I think that'd be interesting. But at this point, I think in the Big 12, I'm not sure that they need the run game to be great. But if you want to go play for, playoff wins, if that's an aspiration, I think you're going to need to run the ball better than they have right now. So, I don't know where it goes from here, but Gabriel's covering up a little bit of that. Of course, he's covering up a lot of things, doing a lot of great things. I mean, I think his Heisman odds went up over the weekend, Barry.
No doubt about it. If you look at Gabriel, he sort of snuck up on people in the Big 12. Not a lot of debate or support for Gabriel as the Big 12's best quarterback going into this season, but he's clearly been the best quarterback in the Big 12. He leads the conference in yards, touchdowns, quarterback rating, and he would be the leader in completion percentage if it weren't for Jalen Daniels, who has only played a couple of games. So he's clearly playing great. Some of the Heisman contenders have sort of fallen off. Michael Penix Jr. up at Washington, clearly the front runner, but everybody's old pal Caleb Williams had a miserable night in South Bend. His chances of repeating at the Heisman not great at this point. Gabriel's going up the ladder. What do you think, Jacko? Could in 2000 a left-handed quarterback led OU to the national title, finished second in the Heisman race. We're making no predictions about the national title right now, but How about a second place or at least a trip to New York for the Heisman?
Seems pretty likely at this point. I mean, I think that OU beating Texas and him, performing better than Quinn Ewers, I think that's a good feather in the cap. Obviously, all these Pac-12 quarterbacks playing each other. And, we saw obviously Penix beat Bo Nix in Oregon. So that elevates Penix. We're going to see some USC matching up against these teams. So I think the Pac-12 quarterback battle will play out on the field because they're going to have to play each other. So then, the question becomes, does anybody else from, say, the Big Ten or the ACC, Jordan Travis down at Florida State, there's going to be some other guys in the conversation. But if OU keeps winning, and there's no reason to think they won't keep winning at this point, and Gabriel keeps performing well, I think he's at least going to get an invite. And, then, we'll see. We'll see how the voting goes. But I think he's going to be a finalist because I think the Sooners keep winning, which, frankly, we haven't talked about the playoff yet, Barry. The Sooners' odds for the playoff, their path to the playoff. We didn't see them play again this last week, but other teams did. Does their path look better, cleaner, more obvious? What do you think at this point about the playoffs for the Sooners?
Well, it's sort of winnowing down, right? I mean, we've narrowed the number of unbeatens. The ACC lost 2 unbeatens in upsets, I'm sorry, they lost 1 unbeaten on Saturday. North Carolina State in the race, but we're getting into a smaller pack, and Sooners are at least in the race. This is like the 1,600 meters, and everybody's ran about 700 meters. So about halfway, start to make your move here. What we haven't had is a rash of upsets, I don't think.
Yeah.
So the key is who's going to lose a game maybe they shouldn't lose. It's when Washington plays Oregon, when OU plays Texas. Those are the kinds of games somebody's got to lose. So you're automatically going to have an 0-loss team and a 1-loss team. But can you avoid the pothole of losing to a Central Florida or a Kansas or Bedlam? That's what the Sooners need to do to get back to that game against Arlington and in Arlington against probably Texas, and see how you do. At that point, you might have such a good rosy situation, depending on how it all breaks out, that you wouldn't even have to win. We saw TCU last year go in unbeaten into the Big 12 championship game, lose, still go to the playoff. The key is getting there unscathed, and then take your chances. If it's Texas at 11-1, you're going to have to beat Texas, I think, a second time. But that's something any Sooner fan would take right now, is a rematch with Texas as an unbeaten Big 12 front runner.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's if Oklahoma wants to make the playoff, you at least have to get to the title game undefeated because of the way the Big 12 is this year. I mean, it's wildly entertaining for those of us watching it because you literally have no idea the outcome of games before they start. You know, you don't, who's going to win? A lot of years you could look at the list of games and say, oh, I can pick at least, 5 of the 6 winners this week or whatever. Now it seems like it's just toss up. So this is a league that, while entertaining, is not as good as it has been some other years. You referenced that earlier, Barry. But I think that means that if Oklahoma wants to get to the playoff, they have to win out the regular season and then see where things stand in the Big 12 title game. But I think that they've got a good chance to win out the way that they're playing right now. UCF on the docket for Saturday. What's your score prediction for Saturday, Barry? I got the Sooners winning 40-24. How about that?
Well, that's in the neighborhood. I think I'm going to say 47-21. UCF can move the ball. Timmy McClain is a solid quarterback, and John Reese Plumlee, in theory, could be coming back at some point. I haven't heard today what Gus has said about the availability of his quarterback, but I do think Sooners will have to score quite a bit to have a comforting advantage. The good news is I think they will score a bunch. UCF, if my memory is right, I think UCF gave up 50 to Kansas. So yeah. I think Sooners can get in that neighborhood pretty easily. I'm going to say 47-21. Hey, that's all the time we've got this week. Remember, the Sooners play Central Florida on Saturday at Owen Field. We'll have all sorts of OU content this week at selloutcrowd.com. We're also at barrytramel.com and jenny-carlson.com. And if this happens to be your first time hearing or watching us, be sure to subscribe to our show on YouTube or your favorite app to get your podcast. And if you like what you hear, please leave a review. Thanks for joining us. As my friend Jacko says, subscribe. See you next week.